Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today, once again, I'm going to talk about the GOAT, the greatest pop singer of all time, Frank Sinatra. So says me, and I would think so says most, or is it say most? Who cares? We don't have time for that sort of nonsense, because it was on this day in 1946 that the first solo album was ever released by Frank Sinatra. Now, he had already been a king of singles by now as a solo artist, and prior to that, as the lead vocalist in many famous big bands, probably most famously in Tommy Dorsey, but also with Harry James. And interestingly enough, Sinatra was such a trailblazer that his voice of Frank Sinatra, 2 years later in 1948, became the first commercially available long playing record. And Sinatra was a first in so many ways. I credit him with inventing the concept album during his Capitol years, something that he would continue on into his very later years. He was one of the, if not the first major artist to found and own and operate a record label, Reprise Records, in 1961. And that, for me, is where the Sinatra story gets the most interesting from a musical point of view, because like vintage wine from fine old kegs, I'm of the view that Frank Sinatra's best work was in the second half of his career. The more mature he got, in terms of age, I think the more mature and the more sophisticated and the more interesting he got as a musician. And if I wanted to sort of draw a line in the sand in terms of where this happened, I would say that it began when he started Reprise Records. Maybe it was because he felt that he had no strings attached, that he had full artistic, creative, and commercial freedom. Maybe it was the influence of Bill Putnam and his marvelous studio, United Sound, on Sunset Boulevard, where all of the Reprise albums were recorded, with a few small exceptions. Who knows? Maybe it's just that with wisdom comes great artistry, with age, wisdom, artistry. Who knows? But it was really a renaissance of albums that he did on Reprise, both the more light-hearted albums and the ones I like, which were the more somber, more ballad-driven albums. Because I've always said that while all of Sinatra's music is great, some of the more up-tempo, finger-snapping ones, they show their age. But the 50s, 60s, and the 40s was generally a better time for the US than what, and the world in many parts of the world, than what came later. So people are okay with that nostalgia. But his ballads, his more melancholic, his more experimental albums, I would say that those sound timeless. Most people, the finger snapping stuff they could pin to a certain era. The more ballad driven stuff, I think most people who are musically illiterate or historically illiterate wouldn't necessarily be able to place them at a particular time. And this run in my world began in 1962. It's one of the first. I think it was one of the first three albums he did for his own Reprise, and this was Sinatra in Strings. It was arranged by Don Costa, my favorite arranger ever, and to me, this was when Sinatra really started to fly, and he really went from strength to strength throughout the 1960s. All Alone from 1962, another absolutely wonderful album arranged by the equally good arranger Gordon Jenkins. Um, then you've got Softly as I Leave You from 64, a really underrated album, but really, really good stuff. Don Costa again appears there. That's followed up by September of My Years, Gordon Jenkins arranging there. Moonlight Sinatra a few years later, another underrated album. Then Strangers of the Night, Nelson Riddle in 66. That's Life. I love that song and that album again, 66. He was really on a roll. And while a lot of people, even those who like his latest stuff, think that he tapered off in the 70s, that is simply not true at all. Sinatra and Company from 60 was recorded in 69, released in 70. This was a hybrid album, with half of it being a duet with Antonio Carlos Jobim, the great the great Brazilian musician, and the other half of the album being arranged once again by Don Costa. And this has his version of Being Green, made famous by the Muppets, and also a very contemplative version of Leaving on a Jet Plane with all the hippieism of Peter, Paul, and Mary sucked out of it for better or for worse. Then Old Blue Eyes is back, his comeback album, also with Don Costa in '67. Perfect album, absolutely perfect. It's got his version of Send in the Clowns, which I think is the best that there's ever been, and then Some Things I've Missed from 1974, one of the very, very best. Also, I should say, from Old Blue Eyes is Back, he not only came in with a bang after a brief retirement, but one of his best ever songs is on that album, Let Me Try Again, with English lyrics by Paul Anka. And so, really, really superb stuff. Of course, by the 80s, things had slowed down, but at the end of the 70s, and early 80s, he was still, frankly, doing some interesting stuff. I mean, She Shot Me Down in the early 80s, a very, very underrated album. Again, Don Costa there, really, really interesting stuff. Check out the song Monday Morning Quarterback, absolutely brilliant. And then his final sort of proper album, LA Is My Lady from '84, which saw him reunited with Quincy Jones. And it really things came full circle because Quincy, obviously, because he had a long life and because he was an innovator himself, he began in the big band era, but in many ways got most famous in the electro-funk, electropop era of the '80s, producing most famously Michael Jackson's biggest albums. And he was the producer and arranger of this album, and he even on the title track to LA Is My Lady gave it that 1980s soul production. And the music video features David Lee Roth, Eddie Van Halen, Dean Martin, so many of the people of that era and before. Really fun stuff. So while all of Sinatra's stuff is great, the timbre of his voice matured a lot between the 40s and the 50s. It stayed relatively consistent between the mid 50s and the very end. But in terms of his finest albums, I would say the early 60s to the early 80s were the golden era of Sinatra. A controversial view that most people disagree with, but hey, that's why it's subjective. That's why it's music. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.